Hi everybody. Let me stop the music. How are you? How is everybody? Maybe I'll keep a little bit of the music while we are typing and writing. How are you this evening? This afternoon? 4 people. That is a lot for watching me type. But it's good to see you. Hi Clemens. Please let me know if the audio is okay, if it's loud, if it's not loud enough. You pick one. Still loud. I can do less and it should be better. Hi everybody. What are you up to these days? I have literally no proper list of participants. So we're here today to type a little bit, or a lot. Hi Rosimar. Let me see where I am. Yeah, we're doing this in English, just for the record. Even if probably a lot of German-speaking people will be here. Also, it's cold. It was a perfect day in Berlin today. Just while I'm setting this up, it was sunny. It was a really amazing afternoon. We just went for a walk, cleared my head. There we are. Hello, medium. Hello, typey. Thank you, Mariano. For the record, couple of house rules. I mean, we're just like 4 people, but still, most of you will behave well, I'm sure. But generally, what I'm trying to do is type a lot and explain my thought process, explain what I'm actually doing and why I'm typing this. And one of the reasons why I'm typing this is I'm aware that generally the topic of Metaverse is quite divisive, right? Some are critical, and that's fine, I am too. And some are fans and are entirely immersed in it, which is fine, I am too, right? And it's this nuanced and balanced thing where you're a fan of one aspect and maybe a critic of another. That is really the place where I am. And what I want to have is have a discussion around all these positions, right? Make a little bit of room to be ambivalent about things, to be not sure if you're right or wrong about something, and then have a civilized discussion around, well, what's going on. So the rule is respectful and inclusive, right? So no dismissive behavior in chat. I do want to have a back and forth and a discussion. What do you think? So call me out if I'm wrong, call everybody else out if they're wrong, but do it in a civilized way. Obvious full disclosure, as most of you know, I work for Microsoft on Internet of Things and mixed reality, so on Metaverse kind of like stuff. This is a private stream. It's around a private project that I'm doing. I will not speak for Microsoft. I will not speak about Microsoft. I will not answer Microsoft specific questions. So let's keep this conversational, skip the marketing speak, and if I can ask you to do the same thing, that would be excellent. So please, no sponsorships, no ads, no pitching, no shilling, just a civilized way. I promise I won't do any marketing to you, so please don't do any marketing to chat. So summing up, inclusive, respectful, having fun, and no work talk. Close your Outlook, your Google Mail, your Teams, your Slack, and just have a good old discussion about stuff. So let's see. This is what we're talking about. It's a series of articles, and as a little bit of context, why I'm writing this, it's really, I am helpless to answer the question, what is the metaverse? And I assume it's not like that for a lot of you, right? And when you talk to people, there are many different views on what the metaverse is. And I think that's good, right? I don't think the metaverse currently is in a state where you can have one defined answer that is correct in any given circumstance, right? So as the intro goes, some groups actually attach it to like a technology, right? It's virtual reality. It's blockchain. You pick a technology, right? And the issue I have with that is it's usually done by people who are invested in the space, who are working on VR, and then it's VR. If you work on blockchain, then it's blockchain. And I don't necessarily like that, because I usually come from a different area of technology, and I come from a pretty broad area of technology. So I know it's not just one thing. I get it why people, if you're incentivized to do it, to kind of try to create that artificial like boundary around it, but I don't think it's inclusive, and I don't think it tells the whole story. You could also do pretty much the same from a narrative point of view, and I don't think you need to. Let's go back to camera. From a narrative point of view, right? So if you're subscribed to a specific ideology, and then that's great. If you're critical because you don't feel that's inclusive enough, that's also great. But that's also just one part of the story, right? So I really struggled how to kind of even approach to answer the question, what is the metaverse? And that's quite an interesting one. And I started looking into what even are the different perspectives, right? Some of you might have read the article around NFTs and perspective of what is an NFT for, and what are the different perspectives of people in that space, or like Web3, or looking at individual. I feel that got me a little bit closer to an answer, or at least to multiple answers that are true for specific people. But what I wanted to do is start even before that, right? I mostly looked at the situation right now. What's the current state? What are we even talking about now? What are the current trends? What are the current technologies and narratives that are evolving. But then I wanted to also go, okay, that will give me like a moment snapshot, but it won't help me answer the question going forward. So I thought, well, why don't we start from the start and look at different fields now? I mean, I'm old. I'm working on like metaverse like things for, I usually say 11 or 12 years, but even before that, I was entering metaverse even before I was doing it professionally, right? So it is an interesting question to where even start. And I started thinking, how far back do I go, right? Do I talk literally about things like immersive experiences in theater, in like social studies and anthropology, and it should be digital, right? So let's focus on specific aspects, on digital, virtual, and then focus around specific ideas. And originally I thought, okay, this is going to be like 3, maybe 4 article series. Everything is fine, everything easy. We talk a little bit about Snow Crash, Ready Player One, and then we talk about massive multiplayer games, and then we talk about IoT and digitalization of physical space. And then I posted that article on LinkedIn. I was like, hey, if you have any other models that you would like to look at, let me know. And I think I haven't looked, but it was like 40 answers. Amazing feedback. Some of you are probably in the chat from like, okay, look at identity, right? What even is identity? What are different ways on over time how identity in the metaverse evolved? Super interesting topic, and that goes from representation like avatars to things like who you are, who you represent, magic circle, representation of self, and exploration of self. Cool topic, amazing. Thumbs up, another article. And then people, somebody said, oh, why don't you start at narrative explorations? What about Neuromancer? What about the whole Cyberpunk thing? And I was like, yeah, that's true. Probably Snow Crash, yes, it's kind of like a conjured term, but there's so much more in terms of narrative that's going around. That would be super interesting. And then others ask, okay, but what about actual like examples? Give us example, make this more tangible, because a lot, if you look at what is the metaverse, usually it's answered by potential, what it might become. Like I've read the news PwC article or report around the metaverse, and it's interesting, it's nice, it's very forward-looking. It talks about, okay, your avatar is essentially AI-powered, and it can talk to different people at the same time and then come back to you. They talk in a virtual space, and they won't even know it's you, or digital representation or something. Or there's, and these are all great ideas, but it's a vision, right? It's not really tangible. And while it's good to inform where it's going and the roadmap and the current things that are driving the space and where you might invest, it's not really answering the question what it actually is, right? So on a more tangible level, people were asking, well, can you give us an example of a metaverse and a business case around it, right? Where what businesses actually worked and what businesses didn't make it. So that was super interesting. So I just continued writing. I essentially deconstructed the whole thing, and this is where I'm currently now. So this is the intro. This is pretty much what I told you. So these are the questions I'm trying to answer. How did we get there? How did this metaverse start? How did it take shape? And then how it evolved over time, right? And I decided to start in the 80s. So we're still starting with Neuromancer and Snow Crash, specifically with the two. And the way I'm going to structure this is every article is pretty much the same, where I'm setting the scene. What was going on during that time around the topic that I'm going to write about. And for Neuromancer, it's mostly a feeling I want to capture, right? In terms of the 80s. In the 60s and 70s, we had so much future visions in terms of, oh, this is how the future will look. I have this amazing book from my parents that I was reading when I was growing up. I literally had it like it's 40, 50 years old probably, and it was about the year 2000. How we're going to colonize the moon, how we're going to colonize the outer solar system, how we are living in megacities, and how we are even like living in huge cities, megacities under the sea and stuff like that. And obviously that didn't happen, right? So and in the 80s, it was kind of the tipping point where this technology optimism like really flipped. There was major technological progress, specifically like from the space race. I mean, we landed on the moon, right? And there was a lot of military progression in like driven by the Cold War. But really, when it came down to like how does it fundamentally change our life, it didn't really go. So and in terms of like big trends, we just came off flower power, and kind of like from a musical, which is a big cultural force, it was more like replaced by punk, rap, hip hop, electronic, that kind of like hard, a bit of harder things, right? And then in terms of science fiction, we had the shift from outward-looking science fiction, more like space operas, right? Star Trek, even like Space 1999, or those were mostly utopias. And yes, Battlestar Galactica was a dystopia, but it was also had this narrative. It was kind of like the first one where the narrative, oh, we had an utopia and now we're going into dystopia. And this kind of changed from outward-looking space operas that were mostly utopias to inward-looking and mostly dystopias. Even like Star Wars is outward-looking, it's a space opera, but it's also a dystopia, right? Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, like 82, big influence. And then it's just like it really set the like visuals, the visual idea how this like cyberpunk future looked. And we had Tron, obviously, this kind of like computer space as a new dimension, and what kind of like what is beyond the screen, really. There's like, oh, I'm sucked in a computer, and then there's this world. Cool, great exploration. And then the Terminator, Android, like really exploring this, like what is the future for humanity. And then War Games came along in '83, and that was really looking at current trends like computer networking, human-machine interaction, but fundamentally it was about dangers of automated decision making, right? The real premise was around are humans good enough to react to a nuclear threat, or will they actually like hesitate to do it? And their answer was, okay, we take a computer and we make this all automated. And those were real like things they thought about. And then hacking culture, right? And that really propelled it into the public discussion. Right, cool. We have these hacker kids, and that could potentially have catastrophic influence. So we need to talk about this computer stuff, and it really influenced the discussion around internet policy and computer policy, even going back to like computer fraud and making hacking illegal and stuff like that. And the hacking culture itself, right, coming from more like a hardware tinkering, then went into all those different very, very diverse fields, from like illegal networking, phreaking, telephone hacking, to like software cracking, software distribution, but also things like, hey, free and open software, open source really came up, and also digital art with a whole demo scene. Like the intro video you saw was one of my absolute favorite demos in '99 by CNCD and Orange. Fantastic piece. But yeah, those emerge, right? And those also with these like hacker ideology, hacker manifestos, how those different subgroups will behave, and also how they're clashing with like the normies, in that sense, that they don't bow to the law, and they don't like being outlawed, right? And then there was Max Headroom, and in all of that, like kind of like crashed Neuromancer and Snow Crash, right? And the thing I want to do is I don't want to give a synopsis of the book. You can read that on Wikipedia. You should read the book. Right? And the thing I want to do, and this is where I'm very, very early in the writing process, is look at how did these books actually get made. For example, William Gibson was commissioned. Somebody paid him to write the book based on his previous short stories, right? And he was really like in this panic when Blade Runner just came out, when he finished about a third of the book, and he was like, okay, I'm done. This is now what it is. It doesn't matter what I write. It's going to be insignificant. It's like a bad copy. And he spent, like, from what I read, an absurd amount of rewrites trying to get it right, right? 12 times, right? And Neil Stephenson was pretty much the same thing. I'm currently listening to a huge backlog of interviews with Neil Stevens around how did he write Snow Crash. I guess mostly he made shit up. That's what he generally said. He didn't try to, like, predict the future. He toyed with interesting ideas and concepts. Both of them did, in terms of also, and they built a world around that. But ultimately, it was for entertainment, right? And they're amazing, amazing authors, and this is why they can do such amazing world building. But for them, if you hear them talk, it's more like narrative exploration, where they're kind of like, okay, if this is my idea and my concept, and if that's the case, this is how I think things will progress. And they're amazing at that. And besides those books, they really, like, hit a nerve in terms of the zeitgeist. And this is what I want to write about. Not necessarily about the content itself. I want to kind of, like, distract it from the content, because the impact it had was, like, huge, right? Just looking at the big ones, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all of them at some point, or groups within all of them, admitted that this was mandatory reading within their group. It isn't now, for a good reason. But, like, back then it really fit the like aesthetics of the setting, right? The setting that I laid out before, it really fit that like a shoe, where it's like, wow, this is giving us more guidance, this is giving us more ideas, this is how it could be. So it's really, really cool. And so it's not from a technical, nobody read this, or should have read this as a, like, this is a technical guidebook on how to design the future. After all, they're both still a dystopia, right? They're not desirable as futures. But just like, for example, The Matrix as a movie was about a dystopia, and certainly not desirable to go there as a movie, the stylistic elements of them were so relatable and so fitting to the current situation and to the current culture, that it really propelled it forward. And from that point of view, it was kind of like, okay, read this to get an idea how we want to, from an emotional point of view, from a stylistic point of view, make the future. That's super interesting. And so this is talking about the impact, right? First setting the scene, then talk about the actual thing and the actual milestone, and the next aspect is talk about the impact, and the final one is the afterthoughts. And this is mostly around cleaning things up. This can be very, very opinionated, and this usually will be very, very opinionated. I'm going to link some stuff, but, like, okay, just like it, and none of this is finished, right? So I'm using very, very, usually how I write these, I'm just write and I refine. So this is kind of like on the nose. Sometimes it's bullet points, sometimes it's stuff like this, but I mean, Snow Crash is entertaining as a book, as is Neuromancer, but it's kind of like bullshit in a professional sense, right? And the analogy I usually do is Independence Day is a great movie. It's entertaining. It's popcorn. It's schlock. It's amazing, right? And it's about spaceships. And no NASA engineer will look at Independence Day and say, yeah, this is really inspirational for me in terms of how to build a spaceship. And the same really is true around these kind of books. They are good. They inspire a lot, as Independence Day. Independence Day can inspire you to become a space engineer, but in your mind, you should have in your mind that obviously this is not the spaceship you will build, and this is not the technology you will use. You will not like fly to Area 51 and get an insight of, oh, alien technology, and this is NASA. No. So you can be inspirational and still be non-professional. And this is really what I think Neuromancer and Snow Crash and also Ready Player One and some others are. You don't get brownie points for being scientifically accurate when you write a good story. Like I would even argue the harder your science fiction is, the more scientific you write, the more scientific fiction you write, the harder it's actually to digest. The further away it is from being readable. And this is so, like, just an example, and I don't know if I will keep that, but Peter Watts, one of my favorite authors. He's absolutely amazing. But he's like, boy, he's hard to read. Like, I've read his books multiple times, and I always discover something new. And these are the type of books you put down after a couple of pages to just digest what hit you. And that's great, but these are more like dealing with hard ethical questions. So that's kind of what the structure, what I want to discuss, and starting with Neuromancer and Snow Crash. And by the way, chat is awfully quiet, so if you have any feedback or any questions, just shout out, or any comments, right? So now's your chance to get your idea in an article. And after Neuromancer and Snow Crash, I wanna talk about more narrative explorations, right? Because these are novels with a set narrative, right? You read what the author intended you to read, and then there's narrative explorations. And I want to talk about Cyberpunk, and I've mostly written about what Cyberpunk is. So Cyberpunk 2013, or later, second edition 2020, is narrative exploration. It's a tabletop RPG, but it's based on very, very heavily on like Neuromancer and Snow Crash and the idea of cyberpunk as is. And it was so weird. It was so brutal. It kind of took all over the place, the most extreme versions from what it could find, right? And like the characters, the player characters were like, you can play a cop, but all cops are essentially out of Judge Dredd, right? They're like super brutal, super not they're insane. Crime is rampant, right? Mega corporations essentially replaced nation states. There was a nuclear war at some point, and then out came mega multinational corporations. The author, Saskia, by the way, hi. The author was Peter Watts. Let me quickly look some stuff up. Peter Watts. He also has an amazing blog. That is the author. Where do I have his blogs? Rifters.com. So that's his page, rifters.com. It's Peter Watts. He is awesome. And his blog is awesome as well. Like his first trilogy was around underwater viruses. It was just amazing. And look, read his books. It's like it's impossible to try to explain the books. They're so dense. Read them. So Cyberpunk, right? Mega corporations. And mega corporations were essentially, so if you've seen RoboCop, these corporate folks, like one of them is getting brutally murdered in in an executive meeting, and then they go to the elevator, and yeah, it's kind of like big city life, right? So they're really psychotic, all of them. Like they're nomads. They're right out of Mad Max. And by the way, if you actually played the new Cyberpunk game, that's based on originally Cyberpunk 2020. It is a watered down version. I mean, it's still pretty cynical and pretty brutal, but it's watered down. And the idea of like pen and paper role-playing games is narrative exploration, right? They provide you a setting, and then just that, a couple of rules how you can engage in that setting. And the setting really was like this very interesting future where technology evolved to the point where you could pretty much do anything. You could augment your environment, and you could augment yourself with that technology to pretty much merge at some point, right? And literally on page 1, it's like, what happens if you can become your car? What happens if you become your weapon, your gun? So it literally hits you in the intro of hey, yo, what's identity? What's embodiment? Congratulations, this is where we're going now. And then it continues for a couple of hundred pages. It's pretty cool. And it also sets, talks about, okay, you can essentially augment yourself to be anything you want, right? You can change your gender. Doesn't care. You can change your sex. You can change your body entirely. You can change your body skin. You can not only be a human, you can make it so that you represent, you can be furry. You can even be a cat if you want. The price is that you essentially pay that with humanity points, meaning you lose empathy to what you originally were. And first of all, that's super controversial. Like, what do you even mean you can like change your sex and gender? These are discussions we have right now, and that are very, very culturally loaded. So imagine playing this stuff in the 80s and 90s, right? But this is also, and I kept the screenshot. This is a thing that cropped up as a bit of a shitstorm, where people said, well, this thing here, that's pretty transphobic. That's like a girl and showing it's essentially an advertising for penis enlargement. I was like, yeah, that's pretty much what Cyberpunk is. It really forces you to, it exposes you to those questions around, okay, but in this future, it's perfectly possible. Nobody cares about your gender because you can just change it by going to a clinic for half a day and going out, and then you just change your gender. Which, and the idea is really to expose you to those kind of ideas and ask you, is that okay? Because first of all, it will make you uncomfortable. The entire game is designed to make you uncomfortable, in more ways than one. So many ways than one, more ways than one, right? And like the rules are literally, it was official rule number 4 that you can break the rules. If your game master is okay with it, you can break the rules. And there's some other rules, like style over substance is one of the core rules. It kind of fit the like entire 80s, 90s vibe, where style over substance, right? Fake news over real news. But also, are you okay with that? The entire rule book was super uncomfortable, and it was fast paced. So you usually didn't have the time to think about ethics and morals. And if that's okay, you were put in situations where very much you didn't have the time to like think about it. And all that was left after a play session was you essentially huddling, taking a blankie, cuddling in a corner if the GM was really good, and then crying and thinking about what you've done. It was pretty awesome. So this is kind of like my summary of it. It really exposes you to so many brutal questions. In terms of the computer game, Clemens, I haven't played it because I'm also waiting for the bugs to be done. It's now out on PC, so it's on my playlist. From what I've heard from the people I played with Cyberpunk earlier, it's a competent RPG. It's a competent entry in the RPG game sector. It tries to touch it tries to emulate some of the like controversial nature of like the narrative exploration, because this also has to do with identity exploration, right? One of the big themes in Cyberpunk is really identity explorations. And the way this was kind of like solved, how they solved the initial shit show was, okay, you can essentially pick a gender and pick genitalia independent from each other. That's good, that's okay. But you can never, like in a computer game, we're not even close to being able to, like, where a computer game could emulate that depth of exploration. So it's a good, supposedly it's a good game, supposedly it's a good RPG. But if you want that, like, on the nose narrative exploration of concepts, of ideas, of tasting things that might not, or trying to understand if it's desirable or not, that's pretty much, I encourage everybody to play like Cyberpunk 2020. There's a new 4th edition, which is, I think, Cyberpunk 2048, maybe. A bit of a different rule set, but it's made by the same people, so I assume it's pretty much the same. And then I want, and this is pretty much going for okay, narrative exploration, right? What even is narrative exploration? Yeah, detail to character creation. That's kind of also Cyberpunk, because even, as I said, in like the intro, when it explains the rules, and it's awesome to read. So one thing I actually would recommend is get a rule book for Cyberpunk 2020, because besides the rules, it also on each page tells you a little story, and the stories are absurd. Again, this is like, even the rule book is absurd to the point where it becomes funny, because it's so cynical, because it's so over the top. And this is also a defense mechanism, right? One way to deal with that kind of like stress of exploration is to be funny. So read the book, because it's full of those little stories where they did explorations of like what it means to live in that world. So it's not only a rule book, but it's a pretty cool book as well. So that detail to character also, that goes through to even like detail of the rule book of the original. Sounds pretty cool. And in terms of narrative exploration, right? It's really about trying to understand, or trying to set a kind of like frame of reference. This is my world, right? This is my future vision, and then this is how people act within that frame. It's kind of like how books are written, right? If you actually listen to Gibson and Stevenson, when I talk about Neuromancer and Snow Crash, this is pretty much what they describe. They use this approach, which is also why the world building is so good. And then it kind of like, once they have this world in their head, they're kind of like putting people in there, and then they do things. And this is really, and we use this in futures research and strategic foresight, right? We write these narratives. We essentially write kind of like science fiction, or things we think are desirable, and then we're trying them out. Right? And we familiarize ourselves with, is this really a good thing? Is this good? What could be bad? And this really makes it tangible for an audience that is usually not used to like being exposed to those concepts. That might also be wild concepts, like things that are otherwise unthinkable, and let them just explore it and familiarize with it. Read that report. What do you think? Read that story. What do you think? Are you identifying with the protagonist? Are you identifying with this world and this future? If not, why? So these are not predictions and not forecasts, and this is very important. These are just kind of like settings. Some of them might be neutral. No. Some might try to be neutral. Let's put it this way. But others are full on like normative, where they have a goal in mind, right? They taste this future because we think it's good. But they're kind of like detached from details. It's not about trying to create a like technical guide how to get there, or like a technical guide how this like world in detail works. It's more like about broad concepts. So this is where the second article will go into again. I want to write, and this is probably too much. I would love to write how to assess these potential futures, what it makes sense, but yeah, and then it goes back to Neuromancer. So article number 2, lots of work. It's all of those are too big. I'm trying to do way too much in this stuff. But like part 3, I think should be about multi-user dungeons, because it's the same time. So we're still in the 80s, right? And multi-user dungeons and mods are super interesting because, again, from a computer point of view, this is where like business computers and home computers were two different things. Amiga 500 came out, and they're like very, very basic access to internet. But here we are. People created text-based massive multiplayer games. And the first one was Multi-User Dungeon. And they created it at Essex University. And they made it playable and later opened it to the world. It's still accessible today. So this is like literally the first virtual world. And it was text-based. So imagine Zorg, but okay, imagine a text-based RPG and then accessible for multiple people. And the interesting thing here is I personally believe this is the first instance of the metaverse in a digital sense, right? Previously it was about books, it was about narrative exploration, but this, from a digital virtual point of view, these are the first virtual worlds. Because the behaviors that emerged in players, but also outside players, are pretty much what we have today. Since then, we're just looping around in terms of human behavior, in terms of things they shown us. We might have improved the resolution in terms of graphics or audio. We made it differently immersive, but otherwise pretty much all in terms of body chemistry, in terms of how our brains work, in terms of the things that they do to us and do with us. It's pretty much the same. And so it was originally developed by, who developed it originally? Yeah, Richard Bartle took it over, the development pretty soon after. But who was the original author of Mud? Let me look it up. Roy Trubshaw. Yeah, he was also at the University of Essex. It was 79 he did it. And then Richard Bartle, which was they studied together, he took it over. And he wrote articles, since Bartle, he's a university professor now, but he really looked at scientifically this, and he asked the question, who's actually playing this stuff? And he came up with what was then known as the Bartle test. He made like literally the first, not maybe the first, but like, why do people play virtual games? And he came up with the 4 Bartle player types, which was, well, you can be an achiever. Whatever the game offers you as extrinsic motivation, you'll take. You want to have every achievement. You want to beat every monster. You will like completionists, achievers. And the other one are socializers. They literally do not care about the gameplay itself. They care about the social aspects. They will literally just sit in an inn and talk to other people, right? In World of Warcraft, they will sit in Stormwind and chat all day. In Final Fantasy XIV, they will sit there and roleplay the entire time, posting screenshots of themselves. That's perfectly fine, right? The third group is, what were they called? They were essentially a group that is more interested in trying to figure out how things worked. I mean, actually, you know what? He wrote this book, which is really good. Player types. Page 130. Explorers. So they don't necessarily care about the rewards. They just run through your world trying to explore things. And in World of Warcraft, there is people who are jumping everywhere to try to get to otherwise forbidden zones. Try to explore everything about the game. People who explore go very deep in the lore are explorers, right? They try to figure out and try to fully immerse themselves in the world. And then the fourth ones are killers. They literally do not care about the good in the world. They just want to destroy and grief others. Griefers is another word. And you will have those 4 types in your game. It doesn't really matter what you do. If you run a social virtual game, you will have those. And that was kind of like the first look in why do people even play. And the model has evolved over time. Even like when he wrote the book in 93, I think, 96. When was that? 2003. It evolved into, okay, let's look at this over time because people obviously evolve. Let's look at more deep down, interesting reasons why they play, and then came up with this. It's very complex, but then we get into social studies, right? But ultimately, nothing really changed. These are still a good representation of the people we have in modern games, and it's still a good way to talk about those. And it's detached from the level of immersion, the level of front end. It doesn't really matter if you have a text-based front end, a 2D front end, 2D isometric, 3D, VR. It doesn't matter. People play the same, based on the same reasons. And in these worlds, we had the first instances of abuse, we had the first instances of sexual abuse, we had the first instances of play to earn, where people paid real money for virtual objects. We had the first emerge. So all of the stuff we still talk about, we still struggle with, we had back then. It's documented. It's literally documented. And unfortunately, we're very bad at telling the history. Because we have the history. We do have the history. And we have the first design, the first research around why the stuff happens, and the first instances, the first explorations of design, how to try to purposefully steer behavior in virtual games, right? And then different things emerged. So Decomud was more of a P2P experience. Void and TinyMud catered more to a builder type of things. And Lambda Mu is a different kind of worms. But right, really, this impact that we have, like, this stuff, it happened back then. And this is like even like today. If I look, and I wrote the article recently about in design intentions bias, where I'm designing it, where Meta was unfortunate to kind of like fall into one of these traps, right? We know since then that if you give a representation, if you give players a representations of themselves, and if you make it proximity based, there will be bodily abuse. There will be, like, people will get into each other's perceived safe spaces. It will just happen. It happened since then. We have like countless examples of it happening. The last one, even in VR, there was one case in VR, and Quiver was the app. It was an archery game where, oh yeah, they realized actuated hands plus bodies plus proximity is virtual groping. Because killers. It's humans. It's not like people in VR are the better humans. No, it's the same humans we have outside. Even less so if people feel that there is not proper governance as in the real world. In the real world, you obviously don't do it because there's governance. It's hard to believe in human decency when you work in social virtual games. And it doesn't matter if 99% of people are decent, right? You don't even want that 1% in your virtual game world. So, yeah, we saw that and said, you're probably going to have a problem. And they had, unfortunately. So now they're proposing this 4-foot limit of, you cannot get closer than 4 feet, otherwise you'll stop moving, which is another can of worms, because design-wise, we learned in MMOs, you never make the player block other people, because we had that in Ultima Online, as an example, where new players spawned in an inn, they let new players out of the inn, they blocked the entrance, and then shot them in the back. And they couldn't go nowhere, because they couldn't get back in the inn, because the entrance was blocked by the players, up to the point where they surrounded players so they could not escape abuse. So yeah, we know that. We can look at, it's not nice, but we can also look at schoolyards where bullies will surround their victim. It's a virtual representation of something we don't want in real life, and of course the instinct is there to design a virtual world so that it's not even possible. But first of all, you have to acknowledge that stuff like that will happen. And second of all, you have to be careful with your design, because people will not use it how you intended for them to use it, but literally will try to weaponize everything, especially if the digital representation of a thing is somehow attached to value. Because if there's value attached to it, and people with abusive, if people through abusive behavior can increase the value, then you essentially incentivize the abuse in your game. And that happens very, very quickly, unfortunately, if you're not very careful with your design. So, and in MUD, and this is why I think this is pretty important as an article, because not only do we have the first really interesting definitions of trying to define what is the metaverse, what is this like virtual thing. And Richard Bartle, opening his book, he said, well, real is what the thing which is, imaginary is what isn't, essentially fantasy, and virtual is kind of like both, right? It's kind of like has the form of something imaginary, something fantasy, but it has real world consequences. So that's a super interesting definition. Yeah, Mariano. There are bad people out there. Why do we think we can fix it in the virtual world? It's natural of people. Well, the big difference is in the virtual world, you're literally the god of the world. You created not only the world, you created the physics, right? You cannot hide between, oh, it's human emergent behavior, but then again, you build the tools where every functionality can essentially be used as a weapon, right? So you build the weapon. Can you really detach yourself and kind of like lean back and say, oh yeah, it's humans? Essentially, it's the same question that manufacturers of weapons have to ask themselves. And I'm not saying people should not create weapons. It's more like you have to be aware that when you design social virtual worlds, you are literally the one that gives other people the means to be abusive. So it's a really interesting question around responsibility here. And of course, people will be people, but the question is, have you done everything you can to disincentivize bad behavior? And that's kind of what this discusses, right? And so Raf Costa, who's another amazing author in the field, he said essentially, well, we didn't really invite virtual in the real. We stuck reality in the virtual. It's the other way around. We didn't go, oh yeah, and we take a little bit of the virtual world. No. We did the entirety of reality, we crammed into these virtual worlds. And we started with that with MUDs. And all the insights we have is still valid. So Rosimar is asking, how do developments over time were accompanied by legal frameworks, such as technical invention, legal framework? So the first, and I think I mentioned this here, there's this rape in cyberspace. It was documented in a Village Voice. It was the first documented document instance of sexual abuse in a virtual world in 2005. And legally, everybody was, oh yeah, but it's a virtual world. Who cares? And now we know better. The players afterwards got together and had a discussion around, should this player be banned? Did he actually do something wrong? Is virtual abuse actual abuse? So again, we know better now. What should have happened and what happens now is, first of all, in most countries and environments, it's actually illegal. It's abuse, full stop. But even before that, it's disincentivized from a platform point of view, and there's no discussion. You will be banned, and probably you will be handed over to the government. So there was significant accompanying legal things where we had a better understanding of kind of this thing, right? It's imaginary, yes, but it has real world consequences. The other thing was taxable. Virtual money you make with virtual items are taxable since then. And Julian Dibble wrote an amazing book. I think it was My Tiny Life. He documented he was playing Lambda Mu, one of the mods. I think it was it Lambda Mu or EverQuest? He wrote it, I think, also 2006-ish, something around that. And he said, okay, I'm going to quit my job and for a year play this massive multiplayer game and make my living selling virtual items and trading virtual items. And he did. And then he's a journalist, so he documented everything. He wrote a book. And then he went, okay, what do I do with all this money? Do I need to tax it? And back then, everybody was like, I don't know. He literally went to different tax lawyers. He went to the state. He went to the IRS, and everyone was like, I don't know. So also, legal framework. Yeah, tax money you make with virtual stuff is real money. So that's super interesting. And this has happened since then, since the 80s. Mariano, every ban is a virtual jail. Which is not quite true. Every ban is essentially your death in the virtual world. There have been cases of a virtual jail where you literally put somebody in stasis in a specific location in a virtual world. So yes, that happens. It is an interesting question why you would, and that's a design question, because ultimately, if they have temporary bans are kind of like the same, except them not being in the game world. So it's super interesting. And to your point, you're wondering if it can even be achieved, a safe social virtual world. The answer is no. Like history tells us no. And this is also, I made the meta example previously. Yes, they didn't catch one thing, but ultimately it's a constant struggle. I'm not singling out meta here for haha, they are meta and they're bad. It's a constant struggle where we're all still learning, and there right now we might be next. Other companies might be next. Actually, if you listen closely, there's like monthly repeats, but this is also kind of like the grindy, annoying thing that is going down, where you repeat so much and you can kind of like, okay, this was written in this book, and this, you should have read that paper. But also the truth is, it is a different. There is a difference in modality if you change those front end paradigms, where after the fact it happened, you'll kind of instinctively say, oh yeah, because this is comparable to that. But you can never be, and this is also the reason why I don't think a perfectly safe social virtual world doesn't exist. People will be way more creative than you as designer. Like, people are, again, this is a very dark view of the world. Abusers will be so much more horrific than you can ever be. And even a red team of people who specialize in that type of social breaking QA abuse thing will be, because they have infinite time. If you like literally let millions of people into your virtual world and they're spending 10 hours each, well then you can never have that type of testing and verifying. So it will happen again, but at least we should look at the history and learn. And I think MUDs, going back to the series of articles, MUDs is a really interesting one. The Metaverse roadmap so this is from 2006. It was a Foresight project. So it's about 16 years old, and it's still amazing. It is so good in terms of a model how to approach the metaverse, because it's one of the most inclusive ones, but it's also one of the most logical ones. They weren't distracted by technology per se, and it's a super diverse group. There were like game designers in there. There were people from social studies, journalists, futurists, very diverse group of people, politicians, and it's so Metaverse roadmap is an amazing achievement. And essentially, they looked at 2 dimensions. They said, okay, what we can look at intimate, like identity focused, look at individuals, and we can look at a world focused, more an external view, right? What's going on outside? What's the world? What's the environment? And then they said we can look at augmentation and extending the real, and we can look at simulation, where we construct a reality. And then they went on and said, okay, let's start with virtual worlds. It's kind of like, okay, you act as an avatar, virtual representation of yourself within a virtual fictional world. And that can be your avatar in World of Warcraft. It can be like your character in Fortnite. It can be your character in Mud, right? But it can also be like your avatar in a virtual meeting room. It doesn't really matter. The topic doesn't matter here. The setting doesn't matter. The narrative in which if it's a game or if it's a work, it doesn't matter. But then what happens if you take the fictional map and just replace it, literally take one data set, fictional map of Azeroth in World of Warcraft, take that, replace it with a real map of Europe, America, New York. So you're running around in a virtual abstraction or in some form, but you run it in a real map. So Google Maps, and to an extent Uber, because Uber is just a spawn, kind of like for you if you're looking at it, an Uber is a spawn on a map that you can call to yourself in that virtual world. And yeah, it's obviously a real cab, it's a real taxi, but from a platform, from a system point of view, is an NPC you spawn. So super interesting. But if you take that representation and just blow it up, make it big, and 1-to-1 size, and overlay it over the real world, you have augmented realities. So take the map of, in this case, my room, make it big, stick it over my room, and then I can see right through it. So there we have Pokemon Go. We have augmented reality cases, like mixed reality cases, right? But all you did from a conceptual point of view was change the map size and do some alignment. There literally is no difference between the three cases. Fictional people on a fictional map, fictional people on a real map, now real people within a real scenario. But what you just did with the map, you can also do with an individual. So the way you can just augment an individual. For example, in different situations and contexts, you use different representations of yourself. Like your Instagram self is not your Facebook self or your work team's self. And back then, life logging was a thing, but now we know them as social media influencers, for example, right? It's your work identity. Lots of that is identity. And the thing that really came to the realization that all of that is the same. From a conceptual and from a systems point of view, it is the same. And it just has different aspects to it. It has different consequences, it has different modalities, but ultimately the front end doesn't really matter, the representation doesn't really matter. The use cases matter, what you want to do. And most likely the use cases will evolve in a way where they actually travel, where you might start here on your company Slack, where you have a representation, and then go in some kind of augmented reality or mirror world or social world, right? So it's really, really interesting because it's super inclusive. It literally pulls in World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy and Minecraft and Fortnite. It pulls in Google Maps, it pulls in Uber, it pulls in Yelp, it pulls in Foursquare, it pulls in the virtual AR navigation stuff. It pulls in Pokemon Go, it pulls in theme parks, and it pulls in like your work portal. And all of that, they say, well, it's the metaverse, because fundamentally they play within the same platforms and the same systems. So that was super interesting. And it's literally, I think, a 30 to 50 pages paper with like lots of backgrounds. They interviewed, all the interviews are still online. It's really, really good. Really, really good paper. And you can literally find it by looking at Metaverse Roadmap. It's an old website. It hasn't probably been changed in 15 years. It's online. This is it. Lots of smart people. Ed Castronova also wrote a book. Wait a minute. Yeah, Synthetic Worlds. Also mandatory reading if you're doing virtual world design. Amazing book. Jaime Casquillo, also cool guy. Lots of interesting talks on YouTube. I met him once in a conference. Super interesting, forward thinker. And so many. If you like go through the list of like participants, it's a pretty cool study. And it's so interesting. The survey, the thinking behind it. For each of the quadrants, they actually made a sub-study, how they think it will play out. And yes, obviously it's from the early 2000s. The iPhone didn't exist. Apps didn't exist. Like nobody, there was no wild scale people with GPS in their pockets. This is very, very early. This is like literally, what's the setting? I don't think I've written about the setting, but this is like super early. Also in terms of access to internet and things like that. So this is really, really forward-looking stuff they did. It's an amazing foresight study. And yes, it's 16 years old, but I still think it's valuable from the point of inclusivity. and this is why I started, right? I try to be as inclusive as possible in terms of what is the metaverse, and this is really a super interesting place to start. So yeah, definitely an article, and then it goes into the second big wave. Nothing really changed except we had first 3D worlds, but World of Warcraft is interesting because it kind of previously it wasn't really people didn't really care about massive multiplayer games, but yeah, you had EverQuest, you had Ultima Online, obviously, you had Star Wars Galaxies, but they didn't make that much money. You had Second Life, which was kind of like the weird thing, but then World of Warcraft. And it got so super hugely popular. It made such a boatload of money that everybody was doing an MMO. You had like every IP turned into an MMO. Yeah, I don't know, Warhammer Online, Star Trek did one, and other things. See you, Mariano. And they turned into an MMO because money, right? Much like that, there's certain, with AI, artificial intelligence, it's also kind of like this vague thing that it's very hard to kind of like grasp and really take and put somewhere, right? And just like artificial intelligence, I believe that social virtual worlds had these kind of like hype cycles where you had like this hype where everybody supposedly got it, and then it went down and you got multiple AI winters, right? And the same thing happened with social virtual worlds, where World of Warcraft was one of the hypes, and then everybody did it, but nobody could really replicate it per se, and then it just went down. So World of Warcraft was super interesting for that matter. It was a moment where everybody pointed at the thing and said, yes, this. But in the meantime, if you look, there's this weird thing called what they called mirror worlds, and mirror worlds is essentially going back to the metaverse roadmap. Mirror worlds say to have a real representation of something, you need to obviously pump reality into the virtual, right? To have a real map of something, you need to actually take a real map and get it into the virtuality. But they also thought about things. You can get real thing data and put it in the virtual world. For example, the Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam provides a couple of APIs that shows all the spatial data, but also all flights going in and out. It provides occupancy. It essentially provides a full-on mirror world of the airport that you can access on an API level. It's super interesting. So mirror worlds is not just like literally a map, it can be thing data as well. And yeah, we talk about IoT and digital twin, but nobody really like hammered it home just like Malt Wasberg. Like his last article for The Verge was called The Disappearing Computer, and it made this case for the full digitalization of physical space. He essentially took the old Razorfish motto, everything that can be digital will be, and said, okay, but that just means the computer in itself is disappearing. You can talk to your environment. Like if you want something, you don't need to talk to your digital assistants on your phone. You can just literally state it to your environment and something will answer. Super interesting. And yeah, that goes into these kind of like mirror worlds, because if you want to do that, you need to have something of a world digital twin that knows the state and kind of like keeps track of these states of these ghost dimensions. So that's a huge thing, and I don't actually think one article is enough to talk about the importance here. And at some point, I do want to talk about just like Neuromancer and Snow Crash talked about like a frame of mind stylistic essence. There was the visual stylistic, which is Matrix and Ready Player One. And yes, again, you might argue that it doesn't make Ready Player One doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. As much as like Snow Crash and Neuromancer are made choices for narrative purposes and not because of logical purposes. Like for example, Ready Player One, it is just inconceivable that a society would be so high tech and so much technologically involved in one aspect in their VR world, but literally crap in every other aspect of their society. That doesn't work. Like does not compute. There is no way to get there. Because if you're obviously so technologically advanced in this one thing, why wouldn't you have fixed and along the way use that second order effect technologies to just fix the other stuff? But it's a good narrative device. It's the analogy I usually use is the big staircase in Harry Potter. Right? Because the big staircase is essentially a staircase that changes all the time, even if you walk up or down. And that's a great narrative device because it gets the protagonists to where you want, but it doesn't make sense to have as a part of an infrastructure because essentially imagine an infrastructure that is random. Every time you leave the house, you would be at a different point in the city. It, as a technology piece, is just stupid, but as a narrative piece, it's great. So again, these have done a lot in terms of the visual style. I'm not talking about the book Ready Player One, but very much the movie. And also, I want to go into a little bit of a side effects. And okay, when was Ready Player One? When did it actually came out? Just before COVID. So now we're all at home, and this is also a lot of the themes that Ready Player One touched on this like escapism, on this really stylish world. Well, we're all sitting at home, watching our computers or out of the window. Maybe we do things, but we can, right? This escapism really hit home. It was the right moment. It was really at the right time where it kind of rippled. Also as a concept, because again, it's showing a dystopia, a literal dystopia, but it managed to do it in such an exciting and fun way that we overlook that because we're all sitting at home and we need a little escapism. So from a stylistic point of view, good. Also, amazing impact at the right time. But like from a technical implementation, conceptual, methodical point of view, no. We need to talk about Minecraft, Roblox, and Fortnite. And I think those three things really make up the metaverse. And this is why I mean Metaverse Ignite. Stylistically, there's a society scale vision, right? Where society kind of like things they understand what a metaverse would look like, regardless of if it makes sense or not. There's this shared understanding, this shared vision. We obviously have a couple of generations that are already immersed in these kind of like social virtual worlds, also from a build. So they're not just entertainment, and they're not just they're not just consuming them. They're also giving back. There's a creator economy that has been learned, and it's to a large degree able to sustain itself. Right? When you look at, oh yeah, YouTube creator is my dream job. So it's able to sustain itself. And then we have this information that is pumped into the virtual world that is representing the real. And when I say the metaverse ignites, also Raf Costa, he made an amazing statement where he says, well, the metaverse it's kind of like a threshold where we added so much real world value into the virtual that it's inseparable, right? So the virtual becomes so relevant to the real world that you cannot separate both. If you try to get rid of the virtual, it's kind of like if a company or an organization tried to shut down everything digital. It would essentially kill the organization, right? And so he says, well, think of it as a conceptual threshold where we pumped so much real world value and information and relevance into the virtual that you almost cannot escape it, and it becomes part of the physical infrastructure. And that obviously has a lot of repercussions. What about accessibility, right? Are we actually, because reality is pretty much accessible, we try to make reality as accessible as possible. How can we avoid structural bias or structural disadvantage of like individuals or groups, right? If we actually think the metaverse is VR, what about visually impaired people? What about blind people? Are we actually saying that we want to prevent them actively, that we don't care that they use the metaverse? No, we shouldn't. What about like technical literacy? What about access to technology? And again, if in the metaverse I need to have access to technology and also the specific rights to change and impact physical reality, it has to be inclusive. So those are very much interesting questions. If a metaverse actually ignites, what happens, right? And this is kind of like almost where I leave it, and I think this is kind of like where we are at the present. And then it's about, and this is a thing I currently think about a lot, where I think about the duality of the metaverse, right? About the thing that is real and the thing that is a narrative. And the thing that is real, obviously, being if you're an organization, and this was also the feedback at LinkedIn, how should organizations deal with it? How should corporations deal with it? How do they find out what is real and what isn't? And my answer is that essentially it's a duality, right? As an organization, or even as an individual, you can think about what is actual value. And for organizations, that would be, I don't know, profitability. It would be your fundamentals. It would be your company alpha, right? And then your question is, how can you make your organizations better? How can you improve your organizations? How can you improve processes and services and products? And how can the metaverse support you in that? And then where, for example, I don't know, from remote assistance to being able to see service records with AR glasses directly in your factory line, worker safety with IoT and mixed reality, those kind of things, right? But these are more focused, very much focused on operations, operational efficiency, directly influencing profit or profitability. But then you also have like the and you can call that trend, and then you also have the hype. And the hype is not so much focused on alpha, but more like beta. For example, how is my organization perceived from the outside? One is very much internalized and the other one is more like external. How's my organization perceived in the market? If I say, right now, the case is if I say I do something, if I do a press release that I'm doing something with Metaverse, my stock goes up. My stock value goes up. It's just the world we live in. You're also going to be perceived more attractive by people in terms of talents. Right? Wow, they're doing something like for Metaverse. Of course, I want to work there. So that is valuable. I'm not saying that it's only about like business value and everything. This like hype curve doesn't make sense. No. Both have very distinct, very clear purposes for organizations, but also for individuals, right? I mean, I'm doing the stream saying, hey, I'm doing something with Metaverse. There you go. It improves my personal brand. But that's really a duality because there's not much overlap. And I think a lot of my initial confusion, and I see this with people I talk to, a lot of the confusion comes from I need to bring both into a coherent narrative and story. And the answer is you don't actually need to. You don't need to make a business case out of a press release. You actually get in trouble if you're trying to. You don't need to think that something, if you actually do something with Metaverse, in the sense that you're fully digitalized, digitized your factory line, and you're now able to use your phones and directly tap a machine and get the service record of the machine. That's essentially a mirror world and a case in Metaverse. But if you kind of like post that as a PR method, people will just ask, well, it's not Fortnite, is it? So it's really weird. This duality, that what makes you money might not actually get you credit, and vice versa. I don't think it makes sense to try to align those views. I actually think this is where most of the divisiveness comes from, trying to align both worlds, where technology-focused people that are kind of like in the world of trying to create things and for organizations are looking at the hype stuff and dismissing it as marketing bullshit. And the marketing people go, yeah, well, but who's actually getting you the money so you can develop your stuff? You might not like the inflated press release and talking about future AI avatars. Again, going back to the PwC example, you might not like that report, but it gets you the money to develop the real stuff. So it's not like that both are not mandatory. It's just like that currently there's so much divisiveness and so little empathy for each other, that hopefully if I write this, I actually end the right way when I'm saying, look, this duality makes sense. And it's fine. And that's kind of what I want to write about. So in a nutshell, in 1.5 hours, this is the list of articles. I know that there were some very smart people in the chat, so I'd love to get your feedback. You can do it after the stream ended. But this is pretty much what I've been up to and what I'm writing. Back to, oh yeah, I thought this were going to be 3 articles, and I have 2 done, and the 3rd one is coming out, and by the end of the month I'm done. This might take a while. This might really take a while. So yeah, that's where I am. And I absolutely think most of the stuff will in some form find itself into a couple of my talks I'm giving throughout the year. So I'm really ecstatic that a lot of like virtual conferences and events have been planned. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm not going to go to actual events this year for reasons. Well, yeah, I try to attend and speak at as much virtual conferences as possible, and a lot of my thinking will go into my talks as well. Yeah, so that's pretty much the thing. And to these live streams, the articles are for a reason, right? I really try to understand and answer the question, what is the metaverse? But also I'm really not a fan of this current, like, the current climate where we have this like big division between people, even like very, very smart people I know and I love and cherish and I consider role models, are essentially shouting at each other over this stuff. So it's not a good place to be right now. The industry, to an extent, has really gotten toxic. And there are reasons for that, and there are reasons to be annoyed by some of the stuff that is going on, and I get that. But overall, I don't think we're in a good spot in terms of the industry. So this Fieldnotes from the Metaverse is really my, first of all, an attempt to kind of like remind people where we're coming from. Here's the stuff we already know. Here's the stuff we collected throughout the years. And by the way, you worked together at some point. So these are the people that already worked together. But I'm not sure what else to do, right? So originally I thought, could I do a podcast? And there are good ones out there already. I shouldn't waste my time. But I think this stream helps as well. I just do some talking and things, and also connecting on LinkedIn. So I'm still experimenting with other ways to create a more inclusive climate and encouraging a more inclusive discussion, right? Because mostly what I see I see very few formats and where people got invited from multiple parts of that spectrum. If you saw the like quadrants that the Metaverse roadmap made, and even those are the like subgroups and sub-technologies, those usually don't talk to each other, and I wonder why. And also the thing I want to show is, hey, let's be a little bit more inclusive. Let's look left and right, because only then we can also tackle things like bigger ethical questions and bigger society scale questions, and mostly asking, should we, and not just could we. And I personally don't subscribe to any form of futures appropriation where someone says this is inevitable. Technology is not a natural force. It's not a genie that is out. It's not the Borg that is coming and resistance is futile. We can't. At every point we should ask a question: should we proceed? And to do that, we have to be inclusive. There's no one siloed group that should make that decision. It's complex. It's also about as we discussed before, it's also a question over governance. It's a question over how do we regulate the space, because it's clear we're going to regulate the space further. It makes sense. It is good that we do, but the question is how. So yeah, I'm missing that cross-discipline, cross-thinking type of forum. This was really annoying me last year, the end of last year, and then I went to the Enter the Metaverse conference, who did a really good job, really amazing job inviting people from all over the place. Richard Bartle was actually there, as were some people from CCP who did EVE Online, but there were also people like from oh, this is my blockchain startup. Here are my NFTs. Here's my game. Here's my Metaverse. Saskia was there and talked about, here are the industry cases that we did. So it was really, really wide, diverse group. And you might think of each individual group what you want, but it was an inclusive event that was overall very, very respectful, and I really enjoyed that. It really gave me a lot of energy. Where previously I mostly saw people shouting at each other on Twitter. And then again, this is pretty much what Twitter is. So yeah, that kind of inclusive stuff I want to try more about. Maybe it's more of these live streams. Maybe I invite a couple of you. Maybe it's more of these articles. Maybe it's something else. I have no idea. But that's kind of the thinking behind it. Yeah, because I'm mostly fed up reading. I always had a problem staying within one discipline. Let's put it this way. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So, stream 1 done. Make a note of the chat, by the way. You're all super smart people, and I might know you all, but you might not know each other. So at some point, look each other up on LinkedIn. You're really cool. You might actually want to collaborate outside of just being on the chat. That just as an afterthought to the stream. So yeah, and I think with that, let's wrap it. Thank you all so very much for attending. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your questions. If you're watching this after the fact, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn, Twitter, the usual things. There's somewhere on the YouTubes. But yeah, stream one done. Thank you all for attending. Enjoy your weekend.